October 17, 1994, started like any other crisp fall morning in Cedar Ridge, Ohio. The trees lining Maple Street were glowing orange and red, and a cold breeze swept fallen leaves across the sidewalks as parents rushed their kids to school. 9-year-old Daniel Harper sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs under the chair, finishing a bowl of cereal while his mother reminded him not to forget his math homework. He rolled his eyes playfully, zipped up his bright blue Power Rangers backpack, and promised he'd be home in time to watch his favorite show that afternoon. There was nothing unusual about him that morning. No fear, no sadness, no sign that this would be the last normal moment anyone would ever have with him. Cedar Ridge Elementary was a typical small-town American school in the 90s. Beige brick walls, long echoing hallways, metal lockers that slammed shut with a sharp clang. The smell of chalk dust and cafeteria pizza drifted through the air. Daniel was seen laughing with 2 friends near the bike rack before the first bell rang. His third-grade teacher, Mrs. Garrison, later told police he seemed distracted that morning, staring out the window during reading time, but she thought nothing of it. Kids get restless, especially 9-year-olds. Right before lunch, around 11:42 a.m., Daniel raised his hand and quietly asked if he could use the restroom. Mrs. Garrison nodded without hesitation. The boys' restroom was only a few steps down the hall, near the old west wing of the building, the oldest and least used section of the school. A hallway that was dimmer than the others. A hallway where the fluorescent lights sometimes flickered for no clear reason. Several students later said they saw Daniel walking in that direction, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He never came back. At first, no one noticed. In 1994, schools weren't locked down the way they are today. There were no hallway cameras, no electronic badges, no automatic alerts. When lunchtime started, teachers assumed Daniel had already gone to the cafeteria. When the cafeteria didn't see him, they assumed he brought lunch and was somewhere else. It wasn't until final attendance was taken that afternoon that something felt wrong. His name echoed through the classroom twice. Silence answered both times. At 3:15 p.m., when his mother pulled into the pickup lane and didn't see Daniel waiting with the other children, a strange tightness gripped her chest. She walked inside, expecting to find him in the nurse's office or the principal's room. Instead, she found teachers whispering nervously and the front office calling his name over the intercom. The halls were suddenly too quiet. Lockers stood still. The restroom door creaked slightly as it swung on its hinges. And somewhere inside that building, unnoticed by everyone, something had already gone terribly wrong. By 4 p.m. that same afternoon, Cedar Ridge Elementary was no longer just a school. It was an active crime scene. Police cruisers lined the curb with their red and blue lights flashing against the brick walls. Officers moved quickly through hallways, checking every classroom, every storage closet, every bathroom stall. Teachers stood outside in small shaken groups, replaying the day over and over in their heads, trying to remember if they had seen anything unusual. Daniel's mother sat in the front office chair, clutching his school photo, her hands trembling as she answered the same question again and again. Did he ever talk about running away? Did he seem upset? Did he mention anyone strange? As night fell, search teams expanded beyond the school grounds. Flashlights cut through the dark woods behind the playground. Volunteers from the town formed human chains across nearby fields. Police dogs were brought in, sniffing around Daniel's locker and backpack hook. The scent trail led down the hallway toward the west wing, and then stopped. Just stopped, as if he had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no witnesses reporting a suspicious vehicle. The school doors had remained open during lunch, like they always did in the 90s. Anyone could have walked in. Anyone could have walked out. Within 48 hours, the FBI joined the investigation. News vans rolled into Cedar Ridge, satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Daniel's face appeared on national television, a smiling third grader with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. America's missing schoolboy, one headline read. Tips flooded in from across the country. Some claimed to have seen him at gas stations. Others reported possible sightings at bus terminals. Each lead was chased down aggressively, but every single one ended the same way, a dead end. No fingerprints. No ransom calls. No evidence of struggle. Just a child who walked down a hallway and disappeared. Rumors began to spread through the town like wildfire. Some parents blamed the school for negligence. Others whispered about a possible kidnapping ring. A few even suggested someone inside the building had to be responsible. Detectives quietly interviewed teachers, staff, maintenance workers, including the janitorial team. Background checks were run. Alibis were verified. Nothing concrete surfaced. Still, a heavy cloud of suspicion lingered over Cedar Ridge Elementary. Attendance dropped. Parents began transferring their children to neighboring districts. The once cheerful school now felt tense, watched, fragile. Weeks turned into months. The search parties grew smaller. Media coverage slowed. The yellow ribbons tied around trees faded in the sun. Daniel's bedroom remained untouched at home, his toys frozen in place, his bed still made every morning by a mother who refused to give up hope. But law enforcement eventually had to face a brutal reality. Without new evidence, the case was stalling. Files were boxed. Leads were archived. Detectives were reassigned. And quietly, without ceremony, the disappearance of Daniel Harper became what every family fears most, a cold case. By the early 2000s, Cedar Ridge Elementary wasn't just known as a school anymore. It was known as that school. The one where the boy disappeared. New students entering third grade had no memory of 1994, but their older siblings did. And they made sure the story lived on. It was whispered on playgrounds, passed down like a campfire tale. That's the hallway where he was last seen. That locker used to be his. The West Wing, already dim and aging, became something else entirely, a place kids dared each other to walk through alone. Teachers tried to dismiss it as imagination. Old buildings make noises, they said. Pipes knock. Floors creak. But several staff members quietly admitted things felt different after Daniel vanished. A substitute teacher once reported hearing what sounded like faint tapping while grading papers after school. When she stepped into the hallway to check, it stopped. Another teacher claimed her classroom lights flickered repeatedly near the West Wing, even after electricians inspected the wiring and found nothing wrong. No official reports were filed. No one wanted to fuel hysteria, but the stories continued. Students added their own layers to the legend. Some swore that if you stood near the old restroom before lunch, you could feel a sudden cold draft, even in the middle of summer. Others claimed they heard their names whispered when no one was behind them. The locker that had once belonged to Daniel Harper was reassigned. But year after year, kids complained it would randomly be slightly open in the morning. Janitors insisted they had locked it. Administrators insisted it was just a faulty latch. Still, no one could explain why it kept happening. By 2008, the West Wing was barely used. Budget cuts and declining enrollment meant fewer classrooms were needed. Cracks had begun forming along the walls, and parts of the ceiling tiles sagged slightly. The district labeled it structurally outdated and quietly closed it off, claiming safety concerns. Yellow tape blocked the entrance. Officially, it had nothing to do with Daniel. Unofficially, no one argued with the decision. Parents were relieved. Teachers avoided discussing it. But the closure only made the rumors stronger. For the people who had been there in 1994, the building carried something heavier than superstition. It carried guilt, regret, questions that had never been answered. Every echo down the hallway sounded just a little too sharp. Every unexplained noise lingered a little too long. And even though years had passed, there was always an uncomfortable feeling that the truth hadn't left the school at all, that it had simply been waiting, sealed somewhere behind aging walls, unheard and unseen. By the summer of 2024, Cedar Ridge Elementary looked nothing like the proud little school it once was. The brick exterior was faded, the windows outdated, and the parking lot cracked from decades of Ohio winters. Enrollment had dropped over the years, and the district finally approved a full renovation plan. New security systems, updated classrooms, modern wiring, the works. For most people in town, it felt like a fresh start. A chance to erase the past and move forward. Construction crews arrived in early June. Dumpsters filled the parking lot. The sound of drills and sledgehammers echoed through hallways that had been quiet for years. Lockers were ripped from walls. Ceiling tiles came crashing down in dusty piles. The building that had once been treated gently was now being torn open piece by piece. And for the first time in decades, the sealed West Wing was scheduled to be reopened for inspection before demolition. That decision made one man uneasy. Thomas Callahan, now 62 years old, had worked as a janitor at Cedar Ridge since 1989. He was quiet, reliable, and rarely spoken unless spoken to. He had seen generations of students pass through those doors. He had also been there the day Daniel Harper disappeared. While most staff had transferred or retired, Thomas stayed. Every year, every hallway, every late shift alone with the humming fluorescent lights overhead. And though he never admitted it out loud, he avoided the West Wing whenever possible. When the renovation plans were posted in the staff break room, Thomas stared at the line that read, West Wing Structural Demolition, July 2024. His jaw tightened slightly. He remembered the week after Daniel vanished, the sudden maintenance repairs, the temporary hallway closures, the rushed construction near the lockers. Back then, he hadn't asked questions. It wasn't his place. But the memory had never fully left him. On July 10th, the construction supervisor handed Thomas a set of old master keys and asked him to unlock the west wing so the crew could begin tearing it down. The yellow tape was removed for the first time in over 15 years. Dust coated the floor in a thick grey layer. The air smelled stale, untouched. As the heavy door creaked open, the dim hallway stretched out in front of them, silent, frozen in time. And for a brief moment, before the machines roared to life, the entire space felt like it had been holding its breath for 30 years. The demolition of the West Wing began like any other construction job, loud, messy, and routine. Workers pried lockers from rusted bolts and smashed through outdated drywall with heavy swings of their hammers. Dust filled the air, coating everything in a grey haze. Thomas stood a few feet back, watching silently as pieces of the past were reduced to rubble. Most of the lockers came down easily. But near the center of the hallway, one particular section seemed different. A younger contractor named Eric was the first to notice it. He tapped his hammer against a stretch of drywall behind a row of old lockers and frowned. The sound wasn't solid like the others. It echoed slightly. Hollow. He checked the building's original 1968 blueprints that had been laid out on a folding table nearby. According to the plans, there wasn't supposed to be any enclosed space behind that section. Just concrete foundation and support beams. Nothing more. Hey, this doesn't match, Eric called out. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The drywall in that area looked newer than the rest, not brand new, but noticeably less worn. The paint shade was slightly off, barely visible unless you stared long enough. It wasn't something most people would ever catch. But Thomas had walked that hallway thousands of times. He remembered when those lockers were first installed. He remembered when that wall hadn't been there. His mind drifted back to November 1994, just weeks after Daniel disappeared. Maintenance had suddenly blocked off part of the west hallway for what administrators described as urgent pipe repairs. The project had been rushed. Contractors in and out within days. Thomas had been assigned to other areas during that time. He hadn't thought much of it. Schools were always fixing something. But now, standing there 30 years later, staring at a section of wall that didn't belong, something inside him twisted. Eric wedged a crowbar between the drywall and the frame. The first pull cracked it open slightly. A thin line appeared, dark and empty behind it. A strange, stale odor slipped into the hallway. Not strong. Not obvious. Just old. Like air that hadn't moved in decades. The crew paused for a second. Thomas took an unconscious step backward. Because suddenly, that hollow sound didn't feel like a construction mistake anymore. It felt like something that had been hidden. When the crowbar pulled the drywall loose, the opening widened just enough for a rush of trapped air to escape. It wasn't overpowering, but it carried a dry, stale scent, like a space that had been sealed off from the world for far too long. Dust drifted slowly into the beam of a contractor's flashlight as he leaned closer to peer inside. At first, all he could see was darkness and concrete. A narrow cavity, barely 3 feet wide. Too small to be a proper room. Too large to be ignored. "Get a light in there," someone muttered. A stronger flashlight cut through the blackness, sliding across rough cement walls and old insulation. The beam trembled slightly as it moved deeper into the gap. That's when it stopped. There was something on the floor. Curled near the far end of the cavity was a small shape, partially buried in debris. For a split second, no one spoke. The outline was unmistakable, fragile bones arranged in a position no one wanted to fully process. Knees drawn toward the chest. Arms folded inward. The kind of posture someone might take when they are scared. Or cold. Or trying to make themselves smaller. One of the workers stepped back immediately, whispering, "Oh my God." The site supervisor ordered everyone away from the wall and called 911. Within minutes, the once noisy demolition site fell silent except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. Thomas hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on the opening. His breathing shallow. As officers carefully widened the gap for forensic access, more details became visible, fragments of faded blue fabric clinging to bone. A small sneaker, deteriorated but still intact enough to recognize as a child's. Then someone noticed the object near the ribcage. A rusted metal lunchbox, flattened slightly with age. An old 90s cartoon design barely visible under layers of dust. An officer, wearing gloves, gently brushed it off. And there it was, written in black permanent marker along the inside lid. Daniel Harper. The hallway filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Some of the younger officers weren't even born when the boy had disappeared. Yet here he was. Not taken across state lines. Not hidden in some distant place. He had been inside the school the entire time. But the most haunting detail wasn't the skeleton. It wasn't the lunchbox. It was the wall itself. As investigators shined their lights along the concrete surface behind where the body had been found, faint markings became visible. At first, they looked like random scratches. But the closer they examined them, the clearer the pattern became. Repeated lines. Jagged. Desperate. Words carved into cement with something sharp enough to leave a mark. Over and over again, uneven and frantic. I can hear you. The letters weren't neat. Some were backward. Some barely legible. But they were unmistakable. And they were positioned at the exact height a 9-year-old child would have reached while sitting on the floor. Thomas Callahan had been silent for most of the discovery. At 62, decades of experience had taught him to observe and not interfere. But now, standing 30 years later in the same hallway where Daniel Harper had vanished, memories he had buried for so long came rushing back like a wave he could no longer hold at bay. The scratches on the wall. The stale, trapped air. The faint outline of the space behind the lockers. It was all exactly as he remembered, and yet, he had never told a soul what he had suspected back in 1994. He remembered the day the West Wing had been closed off. Maintenance had rushed through repairs, sealing off hallways and locking doors that had always been open. Pipes, electrical work, they said. Nothing dangerous, they said. But one evening, while finishing his rounds, Thomas had walked past that section of the hallway and heard it, faint banging. Like a child tapping on concrete from inside the walls. He had paused, frozen, listening to the hollow echoes. His heart raced. He even called out Daniel's name softly. There was no answer, only a faint, desperate tapping that quickly stopped. At the time, he chose to ignore it, convincing himself it was just old plumbing or rodents. It was easier than admitting the horrifying possibility that had crossed his mind. Months went by. Daniel's disappearance became national news. Thomas kept working quietly, never speaking of what he had heard. Each day, the memory gnawed at him, but fear and doubt kept him silent. Who would believe him? What if he was wrong? What if mentioning it only brought suspicion on him? It was a secret that weighed on him for decades, festering quietly in the back of his mind while the world moved on. Every creak, every flicker of light in that West Wing reminded him, even if he didn't consciously think about it. Now, as the wall was pried open and the skeleton revealed itself, Thomas felt a rush of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 30 years. Shock, guilt, grief, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The realization was inescapable. He had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. That tapping, that strange, hollow sound he had dismissed as nothing, it had been Daniel. Alive, trapped, and desperate. His own decision to stay silent, to trust authority and rules over instinct, haunted him more deeply than any demolition dust or cracked concrete could. As investigators carefully removed the skeletal remains, Thomas stepped back. He watched the professionals document everything: the metal lunchbox with Daniel's name, the carved message on the wall, the tiny fragments of blue fabric clinging to bone. The memories he had suppressed for decades were now undeniable evidence, visible to everyone. And yet, Thomas knew there were details he would carry to his grave. The exact sound of the faint taps, the small footprints in dust he had noticed on a floor that no one else had seen, the gut instinct that had screamed at him to investigate further. He had survived 30 years with the weight of a secret too terrible to speak, and now the truth was out, but the memory, the horror, and the guilt would never leave him. Even after the walls were torn down and the school's secrets laid bare, the memory of Daniel Harper lingered. Cedar Ridge Elementary would eventually be demolished, replaced by new classrooms and parking lots, but the story would never fully disappear. For the townspeople, for the families who remembered, and for anyone who had walked those hallways, the whispers of the past remained. Thomas Callahan retired quietly, never giving another interview. He carried with him the weight of 30 years, the secret he had kept, the sounds he had ignored, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest choices have the largest consequences. He had lived decades with a haunting question. Could he have saved Daniel? And as for Daniel, though justice had never truly been served, his story finally demanded to be remembered. A boy who disappeared, unheard and unseen, had left behind evidence of his struggle, a stark reminder of how fragile life can be and how easily a voice can be silenced. Even today, locals say that if you stand near where the West Wing once stood, in the quiet moments just before dusk, you can hear faint tapping, almost like a small hand scratching on concrete. A haunting echo of a life lost, a secret uncovered, and a reminder that some mysteries, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to stay hidden forever. Because in the end, Cedar Ridge Elementary didn't just hold classrooms and hallways. It held a story that refused to be forgotten. And Daniel Harper, lost but never truly gone, will always be a part of it.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.